Hello, this is a chapter reading for Try Right by Jill Brashear. Chapter 1, The Surfing Lesson. Honolulu, Hawaii, June 1962. Claudia was in the middle of a surfing lesson with a man who looked like a Hawaiian god when the weather ruined her day. One minute the sky was as placid as a lake. The next it ripped open like the seam on a too tight pair of pants. It didn't just rain. It poured. The rain fell in sheets. It fell sideways. She'd been clinging to the surfboard, praying she wouldn't make a fool of herself in front of her surf instructor, who was a dish if she'd ever seen one. Then suddenly, she was fearing for her life. Hawaiian rain was unlike anything she'd ever seen. Claudia remembered she was floating on top of a thin strip of wood in the middle of the ocean, and panic seized her. She gripped the board tighter, her fingers slipping. When she tried to take a calming breath to ease her fear, like she'd learned in drama class, a wave sloshed forward and filled her mouth with seawater. She choked and sputtered toward shore. The beach had, squinting through the rain, been crowded with tourists when she and her cousin had ventured out of their hotel in search of something fun to do. When they'd seen the two Hawaiian surfers offering lessons, they'd made a beeline for them. After nearly an hour of waiting, it had finally been their turn for a lesson. Mary had shimmied right up to the big guy with impressive muscles, leaving Claudia with the instructor who closely resembled a Hawaiian warrior. She couldn't see a thing through the heavy rain. Was there anyone still on the beach? What had happened to Mary? Fear paralyzed Claudia. She knew she had a tendency to be dramatic, but she had a terrible feeling that she was going to die in these foreign waters. She blamed her cousin Mary for talking her into coming to Hawaii for their graduation trip. Claudia's vote had been Paris, where she'd hoped to get a glimpse of her idol, Brigitte Bardot. But Mary had shown her a postcard of Waikiki Beach, and Claudia changed her mind. She'd never seen sand so sparkling or water so clear. Paris could wait. Or so she thought. Now she realized she was going to die without ever setting foot on the most famous shopping streets in the world. She was going to die without the world knowing her name. Something heavy slammed into Claudia's back. She flopped face down on the hard surfboard, her chest flattened on the slick surface. "Hang on!" It was him, the warrior surf instructor. How he'd swum so far so quickly was incomprehensible to Claudia. He'd been standing on the shore, shading his eyes to look at her a moment before the sky split open, and now he was on top of her, his big body protecting her from the rain. He was crushing her, but his weight was a comfort that eased her mind. She wasn't going to die. Claudia swore right then and there, under the shield of her instructor's broad back, that when she got home, she was going straight to Minneapolis to catch the first bus to Hollywood. She was done with pushing aside her dreams of becoming an international movie star. Destiny was calling Claudia's name, spelling it out in neon lights. Almost there! His mouth was near her ear, his voice filling her with a sense of calm, while his body shielded her from the rain. He couldn't be much older than her, but he was hardly a boy. The command in his voice told her he'd done this before. The fear gripping her body notched down to a tolerable level as Claudia realized she was in capable hands of a hero. He was big and warm, and she could breathe under the protection of his body. A tingle of awareness shot down her spine. Being rescued by her very attractive surfing instructor was the most exciting thing that had ever happened to Claudia. The wet slide of his skin against hers awakened a shiver deep inside her. Anticipation eclipsed her fear as his arms brushed the side of her breast. Each stroke brought them closer to the safety of the shore, but Claudia did not want this ride to end. His heart thudded with his efforts, stirring a primal desire Claudia had never felt before. She turned her face to breathe him in. He smelled strongly of the ocean, salt and sea and water man. so different from the boys back home who smelled like sweat, smoke, and feet. He tilted his chin downward, and their eyes met and locked. "You all right?" She felt a little dizzy, but it had more to do with his hips pinning hers to the surfboard than her near-death experience. "I'm okay." They reached shore too soon. Claudia's instructor hopped off the board and then reached for her. He plucked Claudia off her feet and tucked her under one arm. The board went under his other arm. The thick rain made it impossible to see, but he seemed to know where he was going. The sand under her feet gave way to earth as they ducked under the cover of a grove of palms. A dozen others had had the same idea, and they huddled together under the thin shelter of the leaves as rain streamed from the sky. Relief flooded Claudia when she spotted her cousin Mary and the other surf instructor, who looked like he'd been hewn from a bronze mountain. She waved at Mary, sending her a silent thank you for choosing the beefcake surfer. Mary lifted her arm and waved back, beaming. The girls had gotten more of an adventure than they'd bargained for, but Claudia wasn't complaining. Her surf instructor leaned his board against a tree trunk and gazed out at the pouring rain. "It'd stay clear in 1 second, yeah?" Rain plastered his dark hair to his forehead and dripped down his cheeks. "My grandma would say this is a sign, or some shit like that." "What?" Claudia squinted up at him, trying to decode what he said. Her Midwest twang seemed clumsy compared to the music of his words. He glanced sideways and down at her. "We can resume the lesson in just 1 minute," he said, enunciating in overly perfect English. "The rain won't last long." "Oh." A blush crept over her cheeks as she shifted closer to him to make room for a few others dashing out of the rain. "I'm sorry. I'm so horrible at surfing." "Nah." He waved his hand at her, blessing her with a rare small smile. "You'll get the hang of it." So far he'd been stingy with his smiles, probably because Claudia was indeed horrible at surfing. She'd been hoping to impress him before the rain had sprung up out of nowhere, but she had the feeling he didn't impress easily. She got the feeling he didn't enjoy giving lessons. Unlike his buddy, who'd been full of white-toothed smiles for Mary, Claudia's instructor had been all business. He hadn't even allowed her to touch his board for the first 20 minutes of the lesson. He'd insisted she lay flat on the sand and learn to paddle first. It had been humiliating. She'd felt like a sea turtle, flapping useless legs in the sand. When he'd finally given her permission to wade into the water with his board, she'd flipped it over while trying to get on. He'd spared her a glance filled with barely concealed contempt and told her not to try so hard. "You cannot control everything, yeah?" he said cryptically. That prophecy had fulfilled itself when the rain came. Claudia studied the surfer's stoic profile as he watched the ocean. "Do you enjoy giving lessons?" His mouth twisted, and he gave a terse shake of his head. "Then why do it?" "I make more in one surf lesson than I do in an entire day at the marina." "Your friend seems to like it." Claudia nodded at the gigantic man and Mary. "Yeah," he agreed, glancing at the duo who were sharing a laugh a dozen yards away. It was the friendliest her instructor had been since they started the surf session. She shuffled closer, pushed her luck. "I bet you're a better surfer than him." He shrugged slightly. "Nah." "Don't be humble." She shifted another inch closer when someone bumped her from behind. "I can tell by the way you took your time teaching me to paddle that you know what you're doing." His shoulders lifted an inch, then dropped. His gaze flicked to her. "He ain't so bad. But you're better." "Surfing is in our blood." His smile flashed. "Where you stay at?" he asked. He wanted to know where she was staying. The tingle racing through her became a full-fledged roar. "I'm at a place called the Surf Rider." His brown eyes narrowed, and he gave her a glare similar to the one he'd flashed earlier when she couldn't stay afloat on the surfboard. "I meant where are you from?" On the mainland, eh? His tone was clipped, definitely annoyed. Her skin heated. Minnesota. He made a noise in his throat that sounded like disapproval. You ever been there? He shook his head. Nah. It's a drag. She looked out at the beach, which was barely visible in the downpour. It's much nicer here, even with the rain. It never rains at Waikiki, he said. Claudia laughed at the perplexed expression on his gorgeous face. It can't be perfect all the time, not even in Hawaii. He cocked his head at her, giving her his full attention. Her knees weakened, and she felt like she'd been stealing sips from her dad's stash of liquor. Lucky we live in Hawaii, he said. I'm not so lucky, but I'll take a week. He laughed, and the low rumble zigzagged straight to her heart. His friendliness made her bold. His energy invaded her senses. Since you hate giving lessons, and I'm hopeless at surfing, let's forget about it. She pressed closer. Why don't we do something else? He crossed his arms over his chest, his muscles bulging. Like what? Anything. She let her voice go breathless, very Marilyn Monroe. Everything. His eyes flicked toward her mouth, and Claudia felt the tug of attraction stretched taut between them, like an elastic band about to snap. She licked her lips, and his eyes flashed up to hers and held. Tension crackled in the air between them. Desire spread through her belly and licked lower. Her heart hammered, and her knees turned to jelly. None of the boys back home had made her feel this aware of her body. His very nearness made her nipples harden to tight pebbles. Claudia shifted closer, brushing her breast against his bicep. A spark ignited in his dark eyes. I have a week, she said. Show me everything. A loud cheer went up from the grove of palm trees, and Claudia realized the rain had stopped as suddenly as it had started. Everyone ran back to the beach, except them. They didn't move. What's your name again? What's your name again? His eyes were back on hers, warm velvet brown. Claudia. She wet her dry lips with the tip of her tongue. And yours? Keone. His eyes drifted down her body, scalding hot. I don't like tourists. Ain't that a bite? Her voice was husky. She gathered her courage and reached up to brush a hank of wet hair from his forehead. Because I really like you. Keone caught her wrist, sending a throb of anticipation from the pads of his fingers straight to her core. Claudia swallowed roughly and channeled Marilyn, Bridget, and Jane. She stretched up on her toes and pressed a kiss to Keone's mouth. He froze. His mouth was firm against hers, resistant, his muscles tense and tight. She moved her lips across his, tasting him, breathing him in. It was like kissing a statue. She'd never been so bold in her life, and his rejection cut deeply. Disappointment swept through her as she ended the kiss. She settled back on her heels just as his hand curved around her arm, and he yanked her behind a big tree. You're trouble, he said. He pinned her against the tree, and his mouth crashed down on hers. Passion exploded inside her as he took her mouth with a passion she'd never dreamed existed. Bold and confident, his kiss erased all memories of the fumbling exchanges she'd had back home. His kiss, he kissed like a man. The others had been nothing but boys. Keone was the one who was trouble, the very best kind. Thank you.